Hello, welcome. My name's Kel Tremaine. Welcome to Advanced Research Methods. What I want to do today in the first lecture is I want to give you a bit of a general introduction to the topic. I also want to introduce non-experimental research design. And lastly, what I'd like to do is also talk about questionnaires and how they're used in behavioural research. So in this orientation to the unit, what I'm going to be doing is giving you an overview of the unit and how the content's going to be delivered throughout the next semester. I'll also talk to you very briefly about the assessments, because all that stuff's already sitting in the learning guide, and I'll also talk to you about how we can communicate best in this topic, in this lecture or in this unit. So all the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, you can find in the learning guide. However, parts of the lecture are obviously a bit more developed upon the learning guide, and I'll also start to go into what is correlational type research. So what we're going to be focusing on today and throughout the next semester is a broad topic of non-experimental research design. So the content is delivered via lectures and tutorials. Now the lectures, they're online and they're divided into two broad streams. One stream is the statistical type lectures. So they focus in more detail on the different types of statistical techniques that are used to look at correlational type research. Then the second stream is the method lectures, the weekly method lectures, which cover the fundamental issues and concepts that you need to know about. For example, how and why we construct questionnaires and the different types of sampling and so forth. So in complementing the lectures, the online lectures, there are also tutorial classes. And these are really where you get the rubber on the road. This is really where you apply the statistical tests or statistical concepts you would have learned in this week's lecture into a practical environment, solving real world type problems or issues. So the tutorials are very much set exercises that focus on that week's statistical lectures. And the tutorials are also your chance to ask about the different concepts and questions that you might have. So all the lecture material, that's available online, but the tutorials are face-to-face, and it's my strong advice that you attend the tutorials, as you're going to be learning the practical skills of statistics in the tutorials. So let's just go through the stats type of the course, and then I'll go through the methods type of the course, or the lectures of the course. So in week 2, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on bivariate correlation and regression. Now this is when we're looking at the relationship between variables. Now because it's only 2 variables, it's called bivariate. So in week 2, we're going to be looking at the correlation and regression when there are only 2 variables. So bivariate correlation and regression are stepping stones to the other types of statistical techniques that we do in this correlational type analyses. In week 3, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at reliability analysis. So here we're looking at in particular, we're looking at 2 different types of reliability. One is test-retest reliability. This is asking the question of how correlated 2 scores are that are measured at different times. Then there's a question of internal consistency reliability, which is asking the question how well all these variables are all measuring the same thing or not. So here you're going to be looking at something called Cronbach's alpha. In week 4 and 5, we're going to step from reliability analysis into something called factor analysis. So in factor analysis, you're again looking at the relationship between more than 2 variables. And in essence, factor analysis is really concerned about getting to the underlying structure in a set of variables, so that a large number of variables can be boiled down or reduced to a smaller set of underlying factors that summarize the essential information that's contained in the variables. Now in week 6 and week 7, we step away from factor analysis and we head into the world of chi-squared, which is we're starting to look at the relationship of more than 2 variables and start to look at the difference between groups on 1 or more variables. So in particular, we're looking at a chi-squared, which is an important non-parametric test that deals with either nominal or categorical data. So there are essentially 2 types of chi-squared that we want to be looking at. In week 6, what we're going to be looking at is a one-way chi-squared analysis, which is also known as a goodness of fit test. Now, one-way chi-squared tests the goodness of fit between the observed and the expected frequencies. In week 7, what we're going to be moving towards is a two-way chi-squared analysis, which is also known as a test of independence. Now, it's not unlike the correlation in that there are frequencies for two types of variables, and the researcher wants to know if there's a relationship between them or if they're independent from one another. In week 8, we're going to extend on bivariate regression that we learnt about a number of weeks previous, and look where we're looking at more than two variables. So where we want to establish a relationship between one dependent variable and several independent variables. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at standard multiple regression. In week 9, well, you've got a well-earned break then, which you're probably going to need given the last 8 weeks of pretty hardcore stats. Then in week 10 and 11, what we're going to be doing is shifting our focus of attention to the ANOVA family of statistics. Now, if you remember, you probably did a between subjects ANOVA, which was looking at one independent variable, where that one independent variable has more than two levels. Now, the next level of complexity in the ANOVA family is the between subjects factorial ANOVA. So this is when we're looking at a between subjects design in which there are more than two or more independent variables or factors. And this is the focus of week 10 and week 11. In week 12 and week 13, I stay with the idea of having two or more independent variables or factors. But firstly, in those 2 weeks, what I do is I introduce the idea of a repeated measures ANOVA and a factorial ANOVA and build that idea into what's known as a mixed ANOVA. Now, this is when there are more than two independent variables or factors, and at least one of them is a repeated measures design and the other is a between subjects design. Now, while these lectures are online, I provide data sets to you for you to practice on. These are the data sets that I'm going to be talking about throughout the lectures. However, the tutorials are really your opportunity to take the abstract and statistical concepts and apply them with SPSS software package and apply them in the tutorial classes with the guidance of a tutor. Also running parallel to these statistics lectures are the method lectures. Now, in week 2, I'm going to look at the process of scale construction. So in this lecture, we're looking more closely at psychological scales, including the process that's necessary for their construction. So you might be wondering, why do we need to develop measuring instruments consisting of a range of items? Now, if I want to know whether a person's introverted or extroverted, why not just give them a simple 7-point Likert scale and ask the person to indicate whether they're introvert or extrovert on that scale of 1 through to 7. From very extroverted to very introverted. Which are they? Or if I wanted to know your attitude towards abortion, why don't I just ask you whether it's favourable, unfavourable, or neutral? Well, the problem is these are rather crude measures. But if your variables are hypothetical constructs that aren't directly observable, that is, they're latent variables, then some sort of measurement strategy is needed, whereby you need to devise composite or observable indicators of the latent variable. Invariably, this involves measurement scales of some sort. Now, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about existing scales, using existing scales, evaluating existing scales, and the steps to develop your own scale. In week 3 method lecture, what I'm going to be looking at is the psychometric properties of scales, in particular, reliability and validity. Now that we've developed a scale, we need to be able to evaluate the scale in terms of reliability and validity. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at, what is reliability and validity, and we define these two concepts. So we look at the different types of reliability, different types of validity, and how we might report validity and reliability. In week 4 method lecture, what I'm going to be looking at is questionnaire design, and in particular the layout and wording. So designing questionnaires requires skill and thorough knowledge of the issues that you're investigating. It's not something that can be done in an ad hoc way, nor is it something that anyone can do properly without adequate training. So now there are two reasons why, or two reasons for designing a questionnaire. To develop a measuring scale, as discussed in previous lectures, and also to develop a survey instrument to collect a variety of data that give you information about a sample of people, usually with a view to generalising to a wider population. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at issues in questionnaire design, questionnaire layout, questionnaire wording, and questionnaire type. In week 5, we're going to be looking at questionnaire design, in particular the response format. So in the last lecture, we looked at issues in design of questions to be used on multi-item scales or measuring instruments and in survey questionnaires. However, a question is not complete without a format for how the participant is to respond. I mentioned two basic approaches in the last lecture, namely open and closed questionnaire formats, and looked at the advantages and disadvantages of each. Now, because it's easier to code, score and analyse the closed or forced choice format, then that therefore is usually the most common. And in this lecture, we'll examine the different types of forced response options that are available. In the week 6 method lecture, what we're going to be looking at is the introduction to survey research. Now, surveys involve collecting information about the characteristics of cases, which are usually means people, but it could mean neighbourhoods, it could mean organisations, it could mean clubs, cities, or even other units of analysis. And it could be not just collected in the area of psychology, but in economics and a whole heap of other disciplines. Now, surveys are collected primarily for two reasons. The first reason is to obtain an estimate of the prevalence of characteristics in the population from a survey of a representative sample. So in other words, to make inferences about what the population is like. The second reason why we would conduct a survey is to address research questions, or to test hypotheses derived from theory. So in this lecture, you're going to be looking at some of the common criticisms of survey research and also look at some of the ways that you can sample from different populations. In week 7 method lecture, we're going to be looking at sampling, and in particular different types of sampling, probability and non-probability sampling. Now, sound knowledge of sampling is fundamental to all research. Now, this material in this lecture henceforth needs to become part of your permanent professional knowledge base. It consolidates the material introduced for some of you in previous research methods units. Following on from the previous lecture, when I introduced the basic notions of representative and convenience sampling, what I'm going to do is going to build up on that and we're going to look at the different technicalities or different types of probability, such as representative and non-probability or convenience sampling. So I'm going to go into that sampling issue in far more detail. In the week 8 method lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the issues that are involved in survey administration. So survey administration, or the design of surveys, typically involves 3 main components. 2 of these, questionnaire or instrument design and sample selection, have already been examined. The third component is the method of administration. Do we want it to be a self-administered methods, for example, postal survey or an interviewer drop-off and collect, or an interview administered sample or method, such as a telephone interview or a face-to-face interview, or even an internet survey? Now, because this has implications on questionnaire design and sampling, the decision about the method of the survey administration needs to really be made at the outset. It's the first aspect of the survey that really needs to be decided upon. Now, here we're going to be looking at some of the advantages and the disadvantages of the various methods of survey administration, in addition to the issues that need to be considered and decisions about the means of the administration that you're going to be doing. In week 9, again, you're going to have your well-earned break. And then in week 10, we're going to, again, stay on survey administration and in particular the methods of survey administration. So here we're going to be reviewing the various issues that need to be considered in deciding the method of survey administration. And this lecture concludes the topic, by summarising the advantages and disadvantages of the various methods. In week 11, we're going to be looking at interviewing. Now, there are a number of different types of interview that may apply in survey research. These range from depth interviews. When research is more qualitative in nature, depth interviews may be conducted to gain an in-depth understanding on a particular area of interest. And then there's a standardised interview, and as the name implies, it follows a fixed protocol for the administration of the survey. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at those different types of interview and the skills that are needed to conduct such interviews. In week 12 method lecture, we're going to be looking at survey analysis. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the issues that might arise as you prepare your data for analysis, from coding of responses to how to deal with missing data. So we're going to look at the different ways that you may also be able to present this data. So that's the way that we're going to run through on the statistics lectures and the method lectures. So I've just stepped through what each week is going to be looking at. For you to also get the best out of this course, I'd also recommend that you learn the content with other students in your cohort in the peer-assisted study sessions, or PASS, which is a student-centred learning program. So in PASS, you're going to be working with other students to understand the content of your unit of the advanced research methods and develop the various strategies to help improve on your academic performance in this unit. So through actively working together with other students, you'll also find that you become more engaged with the content and that your understanding deepens. So I highly recommend that you go to PASS, and each PASS session is run by a facilitator who has successfully completed the unit previously. In regards to assessments, there's essentially three broad areas of assessment. The first is the research project that you're going to be doing. And that research project is going to be handed in two sections, in two different time periods. Those two different time periods are outlined very specifically in your learning guide. But particularly in that research project, there's two sections. Section 1, that's 20% of your overall assessment, and it's going to be 1,200 words. That will generate 20% of your overall assessment mark. In section 2 of that research project, that's going to be worth 25%, and that's 1,300 words. And throughout that entire research project, you're actually taking a research project from the start to the end. You're developing your abstract, you're going through the introduction, you're writing the method or parts of the method, writing the results, writing the discussion, and also the references. So it's actually taken you through the whole process of conducting the research and also writing it up. The second assessment is around the tutorial exercises. So the tutorial exercises consist of 10% of your final grade, and essentially each tutorial from week 2 through to week 11 will potentially count towards the 10% of the grade. So what I'll do is in week 12 I'll roll a dice and I'll choose randomly 3 of the weeks from week 2 through to week 11, and those are the 3 weeks that I will mark across the entire cohort that are doing the advanced research methods. So that will consist of 10% of your final mark. Again, more details are on the learning guide and more details will be placed on views. The third assessment, the exam, and this pretty much consists of 45% of the other, of your overall mark, and it covers the conceptual material from the methods and the statistic lectures and the textbooks and any readings that have been put up onto views. They're also fair game. So it assesses your understanding of both the methods and the statistics lectures. Again, more details on the exam are sitting in your learning guide. Now, how best can we communicate and ask questions in this course? Given this course is an online format with the only opportunity for face-to-face in your tutorials, what I highly recommend is that you use views. Be an active contributor, actively ask questions. If you're thinking of a question, it's likely that 10 other people are thinking of a question as well. So please use views and use the support of the entire cohort in that space. I'll be checking views quite regularly and monitoring that. Also, email contact is another way. And I'll typically respond within 2 working days on that email, or I will have actioned that email within 2 working days and got the relevant people to be working on that. You can also organise a face-to-face meeting with me. Please feel free to do so, but you will need to contact me by email to organise that time so that we can catch up face-to-face. So again, if you've got a question, first check out the learning guide. That's your Bible for the course, pretty much. So if you've got a question, check the learning guide first, because if you're asking a question that's already sitting in the learning guide, all I'm going to do is just direct you to the relevant page in that learning guide where that answer is. Also, check the assignment information sheets that I'll be putting up on Views. And if your question has already been answered, I'll be directing you to the relevant sections of the learning guide, as I said previously. So in summary, attendance at tutorials are highly recommended. I can't emphasise that enough. And it seems to be quite a high correlation between people who attend tutorials and how well they go in the course overall. Those weekly activities, they give you practical experience in the statistical procedures, several of which will be needed to complete your report. And it'll also be covered in the exam. Now, to get the most out of the unit, complete the weekly exercises each week, begin working on your assignment as soon as possible, and make use of the discussion board. Now, most people who study psychology do so because they want to become practitioner psychologists, practitioners who help people with social or psychological issues. Only a few want to go on and become academics or researchers. So you might be asking the question, why do I have to go ahead and learn this boring advanced research methods, and worse still, statistics, I can hear you probably thinking. Well, the reason is that when I work as a psychologist, I still need to evaluate the information that's out there. I need to evaluate the knowledge that's sitting in journal articles and so forth. In other words, I need to take an evidence-based approach. And so psychologists hopefully we're taking an evidence-based approach that informs on what methods they're going to be using. So in order to be an effective and an ethical practitioner, you must really be keeping up to date with the professional literature in your field of practice. And you must subject this literature to a critical analysis in order to evaluate whether there's sufficient sound evidence to support the theories and clinical techniques as they emerge. So just because something's published doesn't mean it's right. You shouldn't simply believe that what you read in books or professional journals, but you should use techniques, you should use your own research skills to evaluate the soundness of the methods and analysis techniques used and the conclusions drawn. And only if they appear sound should you rely on the material. If you detect flaws, then you need to consider what implications that has for the conclusions in that research. Thus, in order to determine if evidence is sound, you really need to have a good understanding of research, of both the design and the methods, and how the data is collected and how it's analysed. So in other words, the statistical techniques, so that you can make a validity, a judgment on the research and the conclusions and recommendations of that research. Now, when it comes to questionnaires and surveys, it's actually important for you to have a high level of expertise in their use. And I can pretty much guarantee whatever area of psychology or related discipline you eventually find yourself in, that at some point it's going to be involving collecting data from a questionnaire or an internet survey and then applying some sort of analysis there. And having the skills in that area allows you to work across a vast area of different disciplines. So for example, I've worked in stockbroking companies using some of the techniques that you are going to be using today. I've worked looking at money flow across countries in terms of mafia whitewashing their money. I've used analysis techniques in terms of that. I've also used it in economics, around gambling research, and also in psychology. So you can see that you can use it in a number of broad fields. I've also used it within schools as well. So it allows you, having a good sound knowledge in this area allows you to have access to a number of different disciplines, not just psychology. What I want to do now is for the remainder of the lecture, I want to pass you over to David to talk about some of the key features of correlational design.